And welcome to the first Scrum of May. We're joined as always by Dan Gardner, the political columnist for the Ottawa Citizen. And joining us this week, Mercedes Stevenson from CTV News Channel. Good to have you with us, Mercedes.
Thanks, great to be here.
And Gloria Galloway from the Globe and Mail. Great to see you again, Gloria. So Steve Stow's obviously a very brave soldier, Craig, doing something that he was told not to do. PTSD is something that the military has identified for some time now. Walt Matinchuk says that they're dealing with it. He encourages soldiers to talk about it. But it's also something that's been around for a very long time, whether it was the Second World War or whether it's now. It used to be called
shell shock, combat fatigue. The difference between these soldiers and those in the Second World War, they both suffered similar combat stress, is one of isolation in the case of the Afghan vets, because there aren't that many of them. But in the Second World War, the whole country went to war, and the whole country came back. And everywhere you looked, you were surrounded by other vets. The mailman was a vet, the postman was a vet, but not only that, people in powerful positions in finance and politics and government were also vets, and they looked after each other. And that was the difference. These guys, they come back, the country forgets them and moves on. But those people had political power, and the politicians had to pay attention to them, and they couldn't be forgotten.
And Mercedes, I know you've been talking to a lot of veterans just in the past week since this report came out about the increasing numbers of suicides. Does the military have a sense of how widespread the problem is within itself?
There haven't been large systemic studies in the Canadian system, but the ones that the Canadian Forces have conducted suggest it's somewhere between 17 to 20% of soldiers who experience combat, which of course in Afghanistan isn't just the people who are on the front lines. It was much broader because it's a different kind of war. That's about 1 in 5 soldiers, and that's so far. PTSD, experts tell me, is expected to get worse as these troops are garrisoned and start having time to think about what they went through. Some of these symptoms don't manifest, and frankly, it's very difficult for people in the military who are trained never to show pain to come to terms with something as intangible as a psychological injury.
And never to complain either. I mean, are you hearing that what Steve told us is widespread or fairly isolated difficulties as any sort of bureaucratic organization will have?
I've talked to a lot of soldiers who are still in uniform. Some of them have lost legs, some have sustained horrific injuries, and they're being told to be quiet, not to talk to the media, that it's not their place. And I think that's devastating, because if they're encountering these kinds of problems in the system, it's not just them either. It's the families, the marriages that are lost, the children who are growing up with this. We owe it to them purely through the contract that military signed, that they will put their lives on the line, their legs on the line, everything else, but the government is supposed to take care of them, and they shouldn't have to fight for that.
Go ahead, Gloria.
Well, I was going to say, I thought that Corporal Stowe was incredibly brave to come on the show and say what he did, but I also think that just by him coming out, it's going to be very difficult for the military to punish him and perhaps punish any other soldiers who might decide to speak out as well. I mean, how would the government defend any kind of ramifications for this kind of disclosure? So at this point, so bully on him.
Well, and it also comes at a time when we're talking about spending billions and billions of dollars on these F-35s. There were a lot of hearings on the Hill this week. A lot of new information came out, Dan. What new did we learn about the F-35 contract and whether or not it's going to go ahead?
Well, there was lots that was interesting, but I thought the part that I found just astonishing was to actually see the document in which Public Works accepted the Defense Department saying, well, we have to have an exception and go with a sole source contract, because that letter reads like they're asking for permission to deviate from departmental guidelines on cocktail party spending.
Yeah, it was like one page and it was like a graph here. Can we please spend $25 billion, basically?
It's breathtaking, and it really raises very, very troubling questions of how much due diligence was actually done, how much consideration was actually done as to whether we really need the F-35 versus some other jet. And these questions are only going to get stronger because the questions are mounting elsewhere, particularly in the United States. Foreign Policy magazine recently surveyed 76 leading experts in military and national security affairs in the United States and said, which program of the Pentagon's would you cut? Top of the list by a country mile was the F-35.
And Craig, I know the Australians are rethinking it possibly this week. So what's going to happen to the whole procurement process?
Right to Dan's point, I think that Canadians could be forgiven if they ask themselves, can this government do procurement properly? Have they lost control of the ability to handle billions and billions in military procurements? And so right now, the court of last resort, if you like, is the Department of Public Works. They cannot fail. And so I think we will probably have to see from them, and will see from them in the coming months, a demonstration of how defense should have done it. And that is, they're going to have to meet with reporters, let the public know all of the details of where they're at. How much does the F-35 cost? Why is it that we're only picking the F-35? What other options are out there? What contracts have been signed already exactly? All of those questions have never been answered by the Defense Department, and I think Public Works has to do a job of being transparent and open, which Defense never could.
The thing that bothers me about this whole thing, though, is the motivation. I mean, I understand the motivation of the military. Military boys like interesting, cool toys. And I understand why they were so behind the F-35. And I understand the government, because once they kind of bought into it, they really had a hard time deviating from the line that this is the best thing. But I don't understand the reason behind the bureaucracy doing this. Why did the bureaucracy decide to deviate from the standard norms? Why did they not put the checks and balances in place? Why did they treat it this way? And I've been scratching my head over that right from the beginning.
It is stunning. I mean, it suggests that something else might have been going on that nobody can put their fingers on.
Yeah, I mean, usually when you see a story, you see, that's why they did that. That's why they did. That's the motivation. And I can't find one.
All right, let's talk. Let's move to the environment and the omnibus bill, Dan. The budget bill that seemed to occur. About a third of the provisions of the budget bill deal with the environment. Is it getting some scrutiny? Is it getting sufficient scrutiny? Because there are some fairly fundamental changes there.
It's astonishing what the government is doing. It is really breathtaking, in part because of the hypocrisy. Remember that this is a government, and in particular a prime minister who spent a great deal of time denouncing omnibus bills elsewhere. Why on earth are they using a budget implementation bill to throw in their entire legislative agenda and then capping the amount of time that we can spend scrutinizing it? There are real serious issues in that bill. There are arguments to be made for many of the changes that they're making, but we're not going to have serious scrutiny. This is just bad government.
Well, you know very well why they're doing it. Obviously, they don't want to have it open to scrutiny, and they don't want to be debating it in the House of Commons. They don't want it to go on forever. I mean, this is just going to be pushed through, and then it'll be done with. It's obviously the most expedient way of doing things.
Yeah, and then you had this week Peter Kent, the Environment Minister, who on another network basically said that some environmental groups were money laundering offshore. We asked him to come on the show. He declined, or his department declined. There seems to be this demonization of the environmental movement that is getting deeper and deeper.
Well, I don't think that it's going to help their arguments. Sure, they have seen cases where particular projects have been dragged out and they've taken too long and the bureaucracy on them is outrageous and they need to have a more efficient system. But putting this kind of rhetoric around it creates a problem, because it creates a problem for their own credibility when they're saying we really just want an efficient process. And then throwing everything in, all these environmental regulations in with the budget bill. You have a majority government. I don't think it would hurt to necessarily function the way Parliament used to, the way it's supposed to, and go by that line-by-line budget. We have a democracy. It's supposed to be, taxation only because we have representation. If our representatives aren't debating the budget, if they aren't considering the expenditures, I think that's a serious problem for us.
Craig, what do you think about it?
Well, what intrigues me these days is the way in which, up until now, there's never been a time in my memory when environmental movement had any real political clout. They've never been able to really mobilize voters against any particular government, partly because they felt they had to be pretty much nonpartisan so they could influence whatever government was in power. What's happening now is, for the first time, they are uniting. I've read now 10 or 11 groups, all uniting in a group which is absolutely determined to defeat the Conservative government.
And tomorrow they're going to be taking out full-page ads in most of the papers across the country. Yeah, this is the Sierra Club, this is the David Suzuki Foundation coming together as one. Is that going to be enough, does anybody think, to get people talking about what's going on?
Well, I questioned their reasoning behind that. They said, well, we remember when Wikipedia did this to protest.
Yeah, they're doing a blackout on
they're going to do a blackout, and they're forming along with Wikipedia lines. And I said, the thing about that, guys, it's kind of like taking a shoe and hitting yourself in the head, because yes, we all use Wikipedia, we all use Google. How many Canadians have to go to the David Suzuki website every week to get their fix? So it's kind of we'll stop hurting ourselves when you guys. But as to the money laundering, let me just quickly make a point here. I don't think that it was Kent who came up with that by himself. Senator Patterson from the Nunavut, he used the exact same terms in a rant he gave in a press release against the Pew Institute in the United States last week. I think this is from the Central Communications Factory.
Of the Prime Minister's office.
Yeah, look, very important point to bear in mind. Peter Kent did not vote in favor of Canada's war against Nazi Germany, okay? and if he objects to
that was last week's line.
And if he objects to that observation, then he's clearly siding with the child pornographers. Look, this government is almost pathological. They have developed this culture in which you don't have opponents, you have enemies, and as a consequence, they use outrageous language like this constantly. And now it's starting to come back to bite them, because it's true, the environmental movement, you know what's happening? Their donations are going up. Their memberships are going up. People are getting angry, and they will when you use language like that.
And we've only mentioned, by the way, 2 groups here. You mentioned Suzuki, someone else, but there are another 8, 9, 10 organizations, including things like the World Wildlife Fund and all kinds of organizations I never would have expected taking what in essence is an active political role against the government of Canada, and I think it could be very damaging for the government that this coalition is united against them the way it is.
I want to just, we only have a couple of minutes here, but President Obama of the United States relaunched his official campaign yesterday. It wasn't a great launch. Apparently had trouble filling one of the arenas at Ohio State, and you can see the pictures here. Craig, I know you and I love to talk about U.S. politics. How's it going to go for him? 4 more years?
I think he could very easily lose. And to win, he has to break a 60-year-old precedent, which is that no president since the Second World War has been reelected with employment above 7.2. Well, it's a whole point above that now. It's 8.2, and it's going to go up in the next little while for sure.
Gloria?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an extremely interesting race. I think that it's going to be interesting in terms of women. I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether what happened with the Republicans and all the rhetoric around abortion and things like that are actually going to influence female voters. So I think.
Well, the rumor du jour is that Condi Rice might be the Romney's running mate, which would make an interesting kind of. Dan?
Yeah, look, in 1982, Ronald Reagan found himself in exactly the same position as Barack Obama in 2010. He was down, the economy was suffering, his polls were awful. Informed observers actually believed that he was not even going to run for re-election. What happened? The economy had a great resurgence and he won a landslide. And the standard metric has always been, if you're in this position, you have to have that economic resurgence, and it hasn't happened.
It's not happening.
They've had some modest improvement, but it's still a really bad scenario. But if you look at the polling, it's astonishing how well Obama is doing. The fact that he has any chance whatsoever is amazing, and there's a key reason for that. If you look in the polling, you find that most Americans, the majority of Americans, blame the economic situation on George W. Bush, which is actually quite rare. Typically, it's whatever the economic situation is, the current president wears it. But no, they're still blaming Bush.
Yeah, 3 years later. How do you think it looks for Obama? I mean, he was very active all week. He was in Afghanistan. He appeared on almost every television show talking about Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, I think it completely backfired on him because he was essentially saying, I'm the one who carried this out. I'm such a great president. And I think someone said, look, even Jimmy Carter would have carried that out. Come on. And it looked bad the way he handled things with the troops. He went to Afghanistan. There were attacks right afterwards. He basically used the Navy SEALs for his own political gain. And then it came out that they'd prepared lines to blame the SEALs if the raid went wrong. He's a great campaigner, though. He's very, very strong on the campaign trail. But I don't feel like he ever made the transition from campaigning to governing. And we'll see whether or not Americans
feel the same way
consider
about it.
That.
Last word, Craig.
I love John McCain's line, which was, I spent a lifetime with heroes. This guy is bragging. They didn't brag.
There you go.